Hello everyone. Look at your commanders. Now back at me. Now back at your commanders. Now back at me. Sadly, they aren't me. But if they entered the battlefield, they could be me. Look down. Back up. Where are you? You're on the battlefield with a Kodama that you always wanted to be. What's in your hand? Back at me? I have it. It's the deck for the two commanders that you love. Look again. Your commanders are all Kodamas. Anything is possible when you go full Kodama. I'm Cameron, and we're already full Kodama here on the Lab Maniacs. Sakashima and Kodama is a new deck that was gifted to us from Commander Legends. It abuses the incredible power of Kodama of the East tree. It says that whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser mana value from your hand onto the battlefield. Sakashima lets us abuse this by becoming a second copy of Kodama. The Sakashima as Kodama, or Sakadama, will trigger the original Kodama. And then if you put in a permanent with that trigger, Sakadama will see the permanent enter play, and then will trigger its own Kodama trigger. The Kodama trigger checks if it put the permanent into play. It doesn't check if a different instance of the same type of trigger put a permanent into play. So each time Kodama or Sakadama puts a permanent into play, the other sees it, and they will give us another trigger, allowing us to continually put permanents into play. This gives us a free engine to chain into our win. So as long as we have permanents in our hand, we can continue the chains and just use Kodama triggers to deploy everything we need. As cards drawn are not guaranteed to be able to continue the chain, we instead work to bounce our own permanents to our hand. This allows us to continue the Kodama chains indefinitely, while also allowing us to get value from the permanents each time they are put back into play. Each combo line involves some method to bounce a permanent, so let's look at them. First up is Cloudstone Curio, which reads, whenever a non-artifact permanent enters the battlefield under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand. This lets us put a land into play with Kodama, and gives us two triggers, one for the Curio and one for Sakadama. We stack them so that the Curio resolves first, returns another land to our hand, and then we resolve the Sakadama trigger, and return the same land to the battlefield. We use these triggers to pick up and put down lands while being able to tap them for mana or use any abilities they have on them every time they hit play. Next up are a group of engines that require mana to activate, but are mana neutral with a regular land, or mana positive with a land that taps for two or more. These include Moloku, the Clouded Mirror, Oboro Breezecaller, and Trade Routes. All these let us tap a land for mana, then use that mana to return it to our hand, and then use Kodama or Sakadama trigger to put it back into play, making it at least mana neutral with any land or infinite mana if we're doing this with a Gaia's Cradle or Nykthos. Out of these three, Moloku is special in that she does a bit more and can let us combo off without having Sakashima in play. Like Oboro Breezecaller and Trade Routes, she lets us tap a land for mana, then use that mana to return it to our hands. But then she also puts a 1/1 token creature into play, which will trigger Kodama. So we can then put that same land back into play. The Breezecaller and Trade Routes can't combo off like this without both Kodama and Sakadama in play, alternating triggers for us. These three have the ability to reuse any land we have in play as much as we want. So we can use our lands to win. We run a number of lands that let us tap to draw a card, then use the engines to reset them by bouncing them and putting them back into play yet again. This lets us dig through our deck. We can then find a Sunscorched Desert and just pick it up and put it down again and again and again, which will ping down all of our opponents. Or if that won't work, we can get Field of the Dead or Moloku and make 1,000,000 tokens to attack with on our next turn. There is one more combo engine that works with lands, but it has a limitation on it. And that card is Storm Cauldron, which reads, each player may play an additional land during each of their turns. Whenever a land is tapped for mana, return it to its owner's hand. Now with the Cauldron, we can put a land into play and then tap it for mana, and the Cauldron will return that land to our hand. The big limitation here is that we cannot reuse lands that we use alternative abilities for. So if we've drawn a card with that land, the Storm Cauldron will not bounce it. We can still combo off with Storm Cauldron, but we're limited in our ability on digging through our deck. Don't discount this combo line, but we do need to be aware of this limitation and plan around it. Once we have our engine online, it's time to look at winning the game. Each of our winning lines starts with Kodama in play, and then either Moloku or casting Sakashima and having it enter as a second copy of Kodama. From there, we try to draw our deck into a Sun-Scorched Desert win, or if we can't do that, into an overwhelming army of tokens, and hold a handful of interaction to protect us until our next turn, where we will kill everyone. Now, we have a target. How do we get there? Lots of ramp, card draw, and interaction. Now, while it may seem that we need to put both Kodama and Sakashima in play on the same turn, rarely does this occur. We're really racing to 6 mana to put Kodama in play, and then aiming to win on our next turn when we play Sakashima. This puts our top-end mana requirement at a much more reasonable amount, very akin to a turbo ad nauseum deck, rushing to get to 5 mana as fast as possible. We're just looking at 1 more to get Kodama out. For our ramp, we have green all-stars like Arbor Elf, Birds of Paradise, Wild Growth, and Utopia Sprawl. But we also have more expensive ramp pieces like Kinnan, Somberwald Sage, and Geode Golem. Somberwald and Geode Golem are mostly unique to this deck in competitive EDH. Our main combo lines are all commander-based, and both provide a significant boost in our ability to cast our commanders. A turn 2 Geode Golem is entirely possible, which sets up for a turn 3 Geode Golem trigger, putting Kodama on the stack for free, while still leaving up mana for Sakashima to land right after. Somberwald Sage can also help us with a turn 3 Kodama. This ramp is not to be underestimated at all. We also have Tezzeret the Seeker, which is a really interesting inclusion for a deck that doesn't have a primary artifact strategy. Tezzeret serves a dual purpose here. His main job is to search out Cloudstone Curio and put it onto the battlefield, but he can also serve as backup to our mana ramp requirements. Not only can he untap our mana rocks, he can also pull out some very choice ones from our deck. Grabbing a Jeweled Lotus or Mana Vault from the deck keeps Tezzeret around while still ramping out our commanders. Or, if we have Kinnan in play, he can pull out a Basalt Monolith and just give us infinite colorless mana. For interaction, we're running the standard suite of powerful counters: Pact of Negation, Mental Misstep, Mana Drain, Force of Will, and Fierce Guardianship. Outside of counterspells, though, we don't have a ton of interaction. One of the big benefits of this deck is that most of the strongest stacks pieces don't affect us. Kodama triggers get around Rule of Law effects, which are everywhere right now to combat Ad Nauseam and Demonic Consultation decks. Our main combo line of seeing Enter the Battlefield triggers aren't affected by Torpor Orb or Hushbringer. Those only affect creatures. We're looking at lands. However, there's one type of stacks piece that can really slow us down. Hull Breacher, Notion Thief, and Spirit of the Labyrinth all stop us digging. So we have ways of removing them or getting around them. We need a specific land, search it out with a Realm Seekers. We need to draw cards, bounce a Hull Breacher with Venser Shaper Savant. We can't cast spells? Well, Kinnan shifts from being a mana engine to a mana outlet, and we can find creatures and put them directly into play without casting them. We're also a primarily creature and land-based combo deck, meaning that a good number of our opponent's counterspells are just dead. Force of Negation doesn't hit our commanders. Spell Pierce, Dispel, Miscast, and Negate, all competitive EDH staples, don't touch any of our primary combos. We aren't casting spells once they're starting to go off. It's all just triggers. We're approaching the game from a different angle and working around all the big speed bumps that our opponents throw at us. Now for card draw, I already mentioned that we had lands that tap to let us draw cards. Now there's a lot of them, and they all have their own unique conditions to draw cards. Arch of Araska requires that we ascend to the city's blessing with 10 or more permanents under our control. Bonder's Enclave requires that we have a big creature in play with 4 power or more. Mikokoro draws cards for our opponents. War Room costs us life. Some of these are worse than others, but they're mostly all online and functional once we have Kodama and Sakashima out in play. Another land of particular note is Oboro Palace in the Clouds, as it can combo with our commanders, along with Tatiova or AC, to draw our deck. Put it into play with a Kodama trigger, tap it for mana, and then return it to our hand. This will get us a land entering the battlefield trigger, and will continue the land trigger chain for Kodama. We can then draw through our deck with Tatiova or AC, and find what we need. We also have the Commander All-Stars of Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, and Sylvan Library to draw cards as we get our combo engines online. And lastly, I did want to mention Prime Speaker Zagana, as she is one of our best draw engines in the deck, and is usually the start of a combo turn. With Kodama in play, we cast Sakashima. It enters as Kodama, and that will give us a trigger at mana value 6 or less. That lets us put Zagana into play with that trigger, and we can stack the triggers so we draw cards from Zagana before we resolve the next Kodama trigger. That's going to give us a new hand of 7 cards, and it's usually more than enough to chain us into our win. And that's Sakashima and Kodama. We ramp, draw cards, and interact with our opponents until we can power out Kodama and Sakashima. And they're pointing at each other like Spider-Man until we win. No praising Thassa here, only Kodama. Kodama, Lama, Dama, Dam. Saka, Shama, Mama, Da. So, and with that, I really went full Kodama. I'll see you guys next time on the Lab Maniacs.